Picture this. You're huddled in a cave with dozens of other women and children, listening to the distant rumble of artillery. For weeks, you've survived on scraps of food and whispered prayers. The stories everyone tells are terrifying. The enemy soldiers are monsters who show no mercy. They torture prisoners. They execute civilians. They're coming for you, and when they find you, death will be a blessing compared to what awaits. Then one morning, you hear voices outside your hiding place, foreign voices speaking a language you don't understand. Your heart pounds as footsteps approach. This is it. This is the moment you've been dreading. You close your eyes and wait for the nightmare to begin. But when you open your eyes, something impossible happens. Instead of the brutal savages you expected, you see something that doesn't match anything you were told. Something that will shatter every belief you held about your enemies. What I'm about to tell you is the true story of Japanese women who were captured by American forces during World War II. These weren't soldiers. They were nurses, teachers, students, and civilians who found themselves on the wrong side of a battlefield. And what they experienced when they first encountered American troops was so shocking, so completely different from what they expected, that it changed their understanding of war itself. This isn't just another war story. This is about the moment when propaganda meets reality, when fear confronts unexpected humanity, when everything you thought you knew about your enemy turns out to be wrong. The women I'm talking about weren't supposed to be prisoners at all. Many were student nurses, teenagers barely out of school who had been conscripted to work in field hospitals, carved into limestone caves. Others were teachers and civilians who had fled into underground shelters when the fighting reached their villages. They ranged in age from 15 to 50, but they all shared one thing. They had been told that capture by American forces meant a fate worse than death. For months, these women had lived in a world shaped by whispered rumors and official propaganda. The stories were consistent and terrifying. American soldiers were savage beasts who showed no mercy to prisoners, especially women. They would torture anyone they captured. They would violate and murder civilians without hesitation. Death was preferable to falling into their hands. These weren't random scare tactics. This was systematic psychological preparation for what Japanese leadership expected would be a fight to the death. The message was clear. Surrender was not an option. If the Americans came, you fought until you died, or you found another way to end your life before they could take you. So when these women finally emerged from their caves and hiding places, when starvation and thirst forced them into the open, they expected the worst. They had rehearsed their own deaths in their minds. Some carried grenades, not as weapons, but as final insurance against capture. Others had prepared poison or sharp objects. They were ready to die rather than face what they believed awaited them. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Because what actually happened when they first encountered American soldiers was nothing like what they had been told. Nothing at all. The first shot came before anyone even spoke. Instead of rifles pointed at their faces, they saw hands raised in a gesture of peace. Instead of shouting and violence, they heard calm voices giving instructions. Instead of chaos and brutality, they witnessed something that looked almost like a medical procedure. The American soldiers they encountered weren't the monsters from their nightmares. They were young men, many barely older than the student nurses themselves. Some looked tired, some looked nervous, but none of them looked like the savage beasts described in Japanese propaganda. They wore clean uniforms. They moved with discipline and purpose. And most shocking of all, they seemed to have procedures for dealing with prisoners that didn't involve immediate execution. The first words many of these women heard from their captors weren't threats or demands. They were instructions delivered through interpreters in calm, measured Japanese. Come forward slowly. Keep your hands visible. The wounded will be treated first. These weren't the words of bloodthirsty killers. They were the words of soldiers following established protocols. For women who had spent weeks expecting torture and death, this clinical efficiency was almost more shocking than violence would have been. Violence they had prepared for. They had steeled themselves for pain and brutality. But bureaucracy, medical procedures, organized processing of prisoners according to established rules? This was something they had never imagined. The interpreters themselves presented another shock. Some were Japanese Americans, men who looked familiar, but spoke with American accents and wore American uniforms. To the captured women, these interpreters seemed like ghosts, people who belonged to both worlds and neither. They spoke perfect Japanese, but they represented the enemy. They looked like family members, but they served the forces that had just conquered Japanese territory. The medical attention came next, and this was perhaps the most disorienting experience of all. American medics approached with canvas bags full of supplies. They checked pulses, examined wounds, and began treating injuries with the same clinical detachment they would show to their own soldiers. They applied iodine to cuts, wrapped bandages around wounds, and even administered medication to those who needed it. For women who had been told that Americans considered Japanese people subhuman, this medical care was incomprehensible. Why would monsters waste time and supplies treating the wounds of people they planned to kill? Why would savage beasts carry medical supplies instead of just weapons? The contradiction between expectation and reality was so stark that some of the women wondered if this was all an elaborate deception, a cruel trick designed to make their eventual fate even more horrible. But the deception never came. The cruelty never materialized. Instead, there were more procedures, more bureaucracy, more systematic processing that treated them not as monsters to be destroyed, but as human beings to be cataloged and cared for according to established military protocols. They were given identification tags with numbers and basic information. They were photographed and fingerprinted. Their names were written down in ledgers and recorded on official forms. To women who expected to be murdered within hours of capture, this administrative attention was bewildering. Why keep records of people you plan to kill? Why create documentation for victims of atrocities? The food came as another shock. Not scraps thrown at animals, but actual rations distributed according to organized meal schedules. Bread, soup, coffee, even small luxuries like jam and chocolate. The portions were larger than what many of these women had eaten in weeks while hiding in caves. The food was prepared in clean kitchens by cooks who treated the feeding of prisoners as just another routine military duty. Some of the captured women were so suspicious of this apparent kindness that they refused to eat, convinced the food must be poisoned. Others ate cautiously, waiting for the pain that would prove their suspicions correct. But the poison never came. The food was just food, provided as part of a system that seemed designed to keep prisoners alive and reasonably healthy, rather than to torture them to death. The sleeping arrangements provided yet another contradiction to their expectations. Instead of being thrown into pits or cages, they were housed in tents with blankets and basic sanitation facilities. Guards walked perimeters, but their weapons were held casually rather than pointed threateningly. The atmosphere was one of watchful supervision rather than imminent violence. For women who had prepared for torture chambers and execution grounds, these tent cities felt like stepping into an alternate reality. Everything was organized. Everything followed procedures. Everything seemed designed for long-term management of large numbers of prisoners rather than for their immediate elimination. The most shocking discovery came when they realized they could communicate with their captors through the interpreters, not just to answer questions during interrogation, but to make requests, ask for medical attention, even complain about conditions. And incredibly, these communications were taken seriously. Sick prisoners were moved to medical tents. Requests for additional blankets were sometimes granted. Complaints about food were actually investigated. This responsiveness to prisoner concerns was perhaps the most devastating blow to their preconceived notions about American brutality. Monsters don't listen to the complaints of their victims. Savage beasts don't adjust prison conditions based on feedback from captives. Yet here were American soldiers and administrators who seemed genuinely concerned with maintaining basic standards of prisoner care. The psychological impact of these revelations was enormous. These women had spent months preparing for death, steeling themselves for torture, accepting that capture meant the end of everything they valued about life and dignity. Instead, they found themselves in a system that, while certainly restrictive and controlling, seemed designed to preserve their lives rather than destroy them. Some struggled to process this contradiction. They had been taught that Americans were racially inferior beings, driven only by bloodlust and savagery. Yet the evidence before their eyes suggested a level of organization, discipline, and systematic care that exceeded anything they had experienced, even in Japanese military facilities. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Others began to wonder if everything they had been told about the war was wrong. If American soldiers weren't the monsters described in propaganda, what else might be false? If the enemy was capable of showing mercy and following rules, what did that mean about the nature of the conflict they had been told was a struggle between civilization and barbarism? The shock of these first encounters would only deepen as the days went on, because what these women had witnessed in their first hours of captivity was just the beginning of a series of revelations that would completely transform their understanding of their enemies, their war, and ultimately themselves. The second day brought new impossibilities. Dawn arrived not with violence, but with a whistle. Sharp, practical, businesslike. The women stirred under their issued blankets, still half expecting the nightmare to resume. Instead, they heard something that made no sense at all. American voices calling out what sounded almost like roll call, but without the harsh bark of military commands they knew from Japanese forces. Guards appeared at tent flaps, but their rifles hung loose at their sides. They gestured for the women to come outside, speaking through interpreters in tones that were firm, but not threatening. Line up here. Stand straight. We're going to count everyone. The mundane nature of it was almost surreal. They were being organized, not brutalized. What came next shattered another assumption about American savagery. Breakfast. Actual breakfast, served on metal plates by cooks who treated the feeding of prisoners like any other kitchen duty. Oatmeal, bread, coffee that was bitter but hot. The portions weren't generous, but they were consistent. Everyone got the same amount. Everyone was fed according to the same schedule. But here's what really broke their understanding of how enemies were supposed to behave. The Americans had brought soap. Bars of harsh, chemical-smelling soap, but soap nonetheless. They had brought delousing powder to prevent disease. They had brought buckets of water for washing. To women who had lived in caves for weeks without proper sanitation, the very concept of their captors caring about their cleanliness was incomprehensible. The delousing process itself was humiliating, but it was also revealing. American soldiers dusted their hair and clothing with white powder, checked for lice and infections, provided clean water for basic washing. The procedures were impersonal, almost medical in their efficiency. These weren't the actions of sadistic torturers. These were the actions of people trying to prevent disease outbreaks in overcrowded conditions. The medical examinations that followed were even more bewildering. American doctors and nurses moved through the groups of prisoners with the same systematic thoroughness they would show to their own soldiers. They checked temperatures, examined wounds, looked for signs of malnutrition and disease. They asked questions through interpreters about medical history, current symptoms, ongoing health concerns. Some of the women were selected for immediate medical treatment, not for experimentation or torture, as they had been told to expect, but for genuine medical care. Infected wounds were cleaned and bandaged. Malnourished prisoners were given vitamin supplements. Those showing signs of serious illness were moved to medical tents where American nurses monitored their recovery. The presence of American women in these medical roles created its own psychological earthquake. The captured women had been raised in a culture where women's wartime role was sacrifice and silence. They were expected to endure suffering without complaint, to serve without recognition, to disappear into supporting roles that kept them invisible. Yet here were American women wearing uniforms, carrying medical equipment, giving orders to male soldiers, and exercising clear authority over life and death decisions. These American nurses moved with confidence that seemed almost foreign to the Japanese women watching them. They spoke directly to doctors and commanding officers. They made decisions about patient care. They carried themselves with the bearing of professionals who expected their expertise to be respected. To women who had been taught that female authority was unseemly and dangerous, this display of competent leadership was almost as shocking as the medical care itself. The efficiency of American logistics became apparent in other ways too. Supplies arrived on schedule. Food appeared at regular intervals. Medical equipment was abundant and well maintained. Clean clothing was distributed to replace the tattered rags many prisoners had been wearing. To women from a country where shortages had become a way of life, this casual abundance was overwhelming. They watched American soldiers discarding items that would have been precious luxuries in Japan. Half-eaten meals thrown away because portions were too large. Clothing replaced simply because it was dirty rather than worn out. Medical supplies used generously rather than hoarded for emergencies. The waste itself was a form of wealth that contradicted everything they had been told about American desperation and resource shortages. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating discovery was still to come, because on the third day, something happened that no amount of propaganda had prepared them for. They were allowed to write letters. The announcement came through interpreters during morning assembly. Each prisoner would be permitted to write to family members back home. The letters would be censored, of course, and reviewed by military authorities, but they would be sent through official channels during wartime to families in enemy territory. The women stared at the paper and pencils being distributed as if they were looking at impossible objects. Letters from prisoners of war to families in Japan during active combat? The concept violated everything they understood about how enemies were supposed to treat captives. Prisoners weren't supposed to have contact with the outside world. They weren't supposed to be allowed to reassure their families that they were alive. They weren't supposed to be treated as human beings with emotional connections worth preserving. Some of the women wept when they held the blank paper, not from despair, but from the overwhelming realization that they could actually communicate with mothers, sisters, children who probably assumed they were dead. They could send proof of life across thousands of miles of ocean through official military mail systems with the cooperation of the very enemy forces that were supposed to be torturing them. The act of writing became its own form of therapy. Women who had been reduced to numbers and identification tags suddenly had the opportunity to be daughters, mothers, sisters again. They could describe their treatment, their health, their hopes for eventual return home. They could ask about family members and village news. They could maintain human connections that transcended the boundaries of captivity. The letters themselves revealed another shocking aspect of American prisoner management. The censorship was real, but it was also surprisingly lenient. References to specific camp locations were blacked out, and details about military operations were removed. But descriptions of food, medical care, daily routines, and even guards' behavior were often allowed to pass through. The Americans seemed more concerned with operational security than with controlling the narrative about prisoner treatment. When replies began arriving weeks later, the psychological impact was devastating in ways the women hadn't expected. Families back home expressed astonishment at the descriptions of prisoner life. The accounts of regular meals, medical care, and organized daily routines contradicted official Japanese broadcasts about American barbarity. These letters from daughters and sisters carried more credibility than any government propaganda, and they began to chip away at wartime assumptions on both sides of the Pacific. But the mail system revealed something even more profound about American military culture. The sheer bureaucratic machinery required to process thousands of letters from prisoners across the Pacific theater was staggering. Clerks had to sort and censor correspondence. Translators had to review content in multiple languages. Military postal services had to route mail through complex international channels. All of this required resources, personnel, and organizational commitment that went far beyond basic prisoner maintenance. Why would a military force engaged in total war dedicate such resources to maintaining emotional connections between prisoners and their families? The only logical answer was that the Americans viewed prisoner welfare as more than just a military necessity. They seemed to consider it a moral obligation that was worth significant investment of time, money, and personnel. This realization struck at the heart of everything the women had been taught about racial superiority and cultural values. They had been told that Americans were spiritually empty materialists who understood only force and profit. Yet here was evidence of a value system that prioritized human dignity even for enemy captives, even during the most desperate phases of global warfare. The cognitive dissonance became unbearable for some prisoners. They had prepared for death and found life. They had expected torture and found medical care. They had anticipated barbarism and discovered bureaucracy. Every day brought new contradictions that made their previous worldview increasingly untenable. Some tried to maintain their old beliefs by explaining away the evidence. This kindness was temporary, they told themselves. The real brutality would come later. The Americans were simply fattening them up for worse treatment. The medical care was just a way to keep them alive for more elaborate tortures. But as days turned to weeks and the torture never materialized, these explanations became harder to sustain. Others began to suspect that everything they had been told about the war was wrong. If American soldiers weren't the monsters described in propaganda, what else might be false? If the enemy was capable of showing systematic mercy and following international laws, what did that mean about the nature of Japanese resistance? What did it mean about the stories they had been told about American atrocities in other theaters of war? The questions multiplied faster than answers, and the women found themselves caught between two incompatible versions of reality. The world they had known before capture, built on clear distinctions between civilized Japanese and savage Americans, and the world they were experiencing as prisoners, where the enemy displayed organizational skills, medical knowledge, and humanitarian concerns that often exceeded what they had known in their own military hospitals. This psychological revolution was still in its early stages, because what they had experienced so far was just the beginning of a systematic revelation that would transform not just their understanding of Americans, but their understanding of themselves, their country, and the very nature of the war that had brought them to this impossible place. The contradiction was becoming impossible to ignore. Everything they had been told was wrong. But if everything was wrong, what did that make them? And what did it mean for the world they would return to when this war finally ended? The fourth day brought something none of them could have imagined: work assignments. When the announcement came through the interpreters, the women looked at each other in confusion. Work? They were prisoners. Weren't prisoners supposed to be locked away, tortured, or executed? Instead, American sergeants stood with clipboards, reading out names and job assignments like foremen at a factory. Some would work in the camp kitchens. Others would help with laundry duties. A few would assist in the medical tents. The strongest would join work details maintaining the campgrounds. Each assignment came with specific instructions, schedules, and even basic safety guidelines. But here's what made their heads spin. They would be paid. Not much. Small amounts credited to camp accounts that could be used at a makeshift canteen for extra food, toiletries, even cigarettes. But payment nonetheless, for work performed by prisoners of war. during active combat against their home country. The concept was so foreign that some women initially refused their assignments, convinced this had to be some elaborate trap. Why would captors pay prisoners for labor? Why create economic incentives for enemy nationals? Why treat captive workers like employees rather than slaves? The work itself provided another layer of psychological shock. The camp kitchens where some women were assigned operated with industrial efficiency that dwarfed anything they had seen in Japan. Massive cooking pots, mechanical food processors, refrigeration units that kept meat fresh for days. The scale of food preparation was staggering. Mountains of potatoes peeled daily, sides of beef processed into hundreds of portions, vegetables prepared in quantities that could feed entire villages back home. American cooks supervised the work, but their supervision was professional rather than punitive. They demonstrated proper techniques, corrected mistakes without violence, even shared cooking tips that had nothing to do with military efficiency. One cook showed a Japanese woman how to make bread rise properly. Another explained the best way to season soup for large groups. These were the casual exchanges of professionals sharing trade knowledge, not the interactions between masters and slaves. The abundance in these kitchens was almost obscene to women who had lived through years of rationing and shortages. Sugar used freely rather than hoarded. Meat served daily rather than saved for special occasions. Fresh fruit available even for prisoners. Waste that would have fed families back home simply discarded because portions were too large or food had been prepared in excess. Working in the laundry revealed another aspect of American industrial capacity. Mechanical washing machines that could clean dozens of uniforms simultaneously. Chemical soaps that removed stains instantly. Drying equipment that processed wet clothing in hours rather than days. The efficiency was breathtaking, but it was also casual, taken for granted by Americans who seemed unaware that such technology was revolutionary. The women assigned to medical duties experienced the most profound shock of all. They found themselves working alongside American doctors and nurses who treated them as colleagues rather than captives. They were taught to take temperatures, change bandages, assist with basic procedures. They were given real responsibilities for patient care, trusted with medical supplies, expected to follow professional protocols. This trust was perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of their captivity. These American medical professionals were entrusting them with the lives of wounded soldiers, including wounded Americans. They were being asked to provide care that could determine whether enemy combatants lived or died. The level of confidence this implied was staggering. One Japanese nurse later recalled the moment when an American doctor handed her a scalpel and asked her to assist with a surgery. The patient was an American pilot who had been shot down over Japanese territory. The woman holding the blade was technically his enemy, captured while serving the forces that had tried to kill him. Yet the American surgeon trusted her completely with his patient's life. The medical supplies alone told a story about American priorities that contradicted everything the women had been taught. Anesthetics used generously rather than rationed. Antibiotics administered to prevent infections in prisoners, as well as American soldiers. Surgical equipment maintained to the highest standards regardless of who was being treated. The care provided to Japanese prisoners was often better than what they had received in their own military hospitals. But the most shocking discovery came when they realized that American women worked in positions of genuine authority throughout the camp system. Female officers who gave orders to male subordinates, women doctors who made life and death medical decisions, nurses who commanded respect from soldiers of all ranks. These American women carried themselves with confidence that seemed almost alien to the Japanese prisoners. They spoke directly to commanding officers without deference. They argued professional points without fear of punishment. They exercised authority as naturally as breathing. To women raised in a culture where female visibility was often seen as shameful, this display of professional competence was revolutionary. The contrast became even more stark when they observed American recreational activities. During off-duty hours, they watched American soldiers and nurses play baseball together. Mixed teams of men and women competing on equal terms, laughing at mistakes, celebrating victories together. The casualness of it was stunning. Music played constantly from portable radios, jazz, swing, popular songs that seemed designed purely for entertainment rather than military inspiration. American personnel danced together, sang along with broadcasts, treated leisure time as a right rather than a privilege. The contrast with Japanese military culture, where recreation was seen as weakness and frivolity as dangerous, was absolute. Some evenings, American nurses would gather to teach dance steps to anyone interested in learning. The sight of women leading instruction, men following their guidance, everyone laughing at missed steps and awkward movements, created a picture of gender relations that the Japanese women had never imagined possible. The psychological impact of witnessing this equality was profound. These women had been raised to believe that female assertion was destructive to social order, that women's proper role was support from the shadows, that mixed gender activities were inherently dangerous to moral discipline. Yet here was evidence of a society where women and men worked together professionally, socialized together naturally, and treated each other with casual respect. The questions this raised were devastating to their worldview. If American women could exercise authority without destroying military discipline, what did that say about Japanese restrictions on female participation? If mixed gender recreation didn't lead to moral collapse, what justified the rigid separation they had known at home? If women could be trusted with professional responsibilities in wartime, why had they been limited to supporting roles? Even small details carried enormous psychological weight. American women wearing pants without shame, female officers eating meals with male colleagues as equals, nurses giving orders to soldiers without apology or deference. Each observation chipped away at fundamental assumptions about proper gender roles and social organization. The letters they continued to write home began to reflect these revelations, carefully worded descriptions of American women in positions of authority, accounts of recreational activities that included both men and women, reports of professional competence that transcended gender boundaries. The censors allowed most of these observations to pass, apparently unaware of how revolutionary they would seem to families back in Japan. When replies arrived, the responses revealed how shocking these accounts were to people at home. Mothers expressed disbelief that enemy women could be trusted with military responsibilities. Fathers questioned whether such descriptions could possibly be accurate. Sisters asked for more details about how American women behaved in professional settings. These exchanges began to plant seeds of doubt about more than just enemy character. They raised questions about Japanese social organization, about the necessity of gender restrictions, about whether alternative approaches to women's roles might actually strengthen rather than weaken society. The women found themselves caught between two incompatible social models. The one they had known, based on rigid hierarchy and gender separation, and the one they were witnessing, based on professional competence and casual equality. Both seemed to function, but they couldn't both be right about human nature and social organization. Some prisoners began to imagine what life might be like in a society where women could exercise authority without shame, where mixed gender cooperation was normal, where professional competence mattered more than gender conformity. These were dangerous thoughts, revolutionary ideas that challenged the foundations of everything they had been taught about proper social order. But the thoughts came anyway. Triggered by daily exposure to a functioning alternative system, every day brought new evidence that women could be trusted with responsibility, that men and women could work together effectively, that gender equality might actually enhance rather than threaten social stability. The psychological revolution was accelerating, driven not by propaganda or political arguments, but by direct observation of a different way of organizing human relationships. What they were witnessing wasn't just enemy military efficiency. It was proof that alternative social arrangements were possible, practical, and perhaps even superior to what they had known. These realizations would only deepen as their captivity continued, because what they had discovered about American gender relations was just one aspect of a broader social system that challenged their assumptions about human nature, cultural values, and the very foundations of civilized society. The question was no longer just whether they had been wrong about American character. The question was whether they had been wrong about everything. The fifth day shattered their last defense against the impossible truth. It started with something so mundane, so ordinary, that at first they didn't understand what they were seeing. American soldiers were sitting in circles on the ground, laughing. Not the harsh laughter of victors mocking the defeated, but genuine amusement at stories being shared among friends. Some were reading letters from home. Others were playing card games with worn decks that had obviously seen months of use. But here's what made the Japanese women stop and stare. These soldiers were relaxed, completely, utterly relaxed, in a way that seemed impossible for people engaged in total war. They had expected American forces to be tense, driven, consumed by the same desperate intensity that had characterized Japanese military culture. Instead, they saw men who joked casually while cleaning weapons, who sang popular songs while performing maintenance duties, who treated warfare like a job that had specific hours rather than a sacred mission that consumed every waking moment. The contrast was devastating to everything they believed about fighting spirit and military dedication. Japanese propaganda had insisted that American soldiers were soft, undisciplined, lacking the spiritual strength necessary for prolonged combat. Yet these same supposedly weak Americans had just conquered Japanese territory with what appeared to be casual efficiency. Even more shocking was what happened during mealtimes. American personnel didn't just eat together regardless of rank. They argued. Friendly arguments, but arguments nonetheless. Enlisted men would disagree with officers about baseball scores, movie stars, the best way to cook eggs. Officers would laugh at jokes made at their expense by subordinates. To women raised in a military culture where disagreement with superiors was unthinkable, this casual disrespect should have indicated complete breakdown of discipline. Yet somehow these same undisciplined Americans maintained perfect military efficiency. Their equipment was well maintained. Their procedures were followed precisely. Their combat effectiveness was undeniable. How could both things be true simultaneously? How could soldiers who joked with their officers also be the same forces that had systematically defeated Japanese defenses? The contradiction made their heads spin. The answer came gradually through observation of how American authority actually functioned. Orders were given and followed, but the relationship between commanders and subordinates included elements of consultation, explanation, even negotiation. Officers would explain why certain procedures were necessary. Enlisted men would suggest improvements to established methods. Authority was exercised through competence rather than fear. This collaborative approach to military hierarchy was unlike anything the Japanese women had witnessed. In their experience, orders flowed downward without explanation, and questioning superiors was tantamount to treason. Yet these Americans seemed to have created a system where authority was respected precisely because it allowed for input from subordinates. The efficiency this produced was remarkable. Problems were identified and solved quickly because information flowed upward as easily as commands flowed downward. Improvements were implemented rapidly because good ideas were welcomed regardless of their source. Morale remained high because everyone felt their contributions mattered. But the psychological shock went deeper than military organization. These observations forced the women to question fundamental assumptions about human nature itself. They had been taught that people needed rigid hierarchy to function effectively. that allowing subordinates to question authority would lead to chaos and collapse. Yet here was proof that exactly the opposite might be true, that systems allowing for questioning and discussion might actually be more effective than those based on blind obedience. That respect earned through competence might create stronger loyalty than fear imposed through punishment. The implications were staggering. If Americans could achieve superior military results through collaborative leadership, what did that say about Japanese claims of cultural superiority? If casual interaction between ranks actually enhanced rather than undermined military effectiveness, what justified the harsh discipline they had known in Japanese forces? These questions became even more complex when they observed how American medical personnel operated. Doctors would consult with nurses about patient care. Experienced medics would offer suggestions to younger officers. Even Japanese prisoners working in medical roles found their opinions solicited and considered. One Japanese nurse later described the moment when an American doctor asked her opinion about treating a particular wound. She had expected to be told what to do, not asked what she thought should be done. When her suggestion proved effective, the doctor thanked her publicly and implemented her technique for treating similar cases. This inclusion of prisoner expertise in medical decision-making was almost incomprehensible. Why would captors value the professional knowledge of enemy personnel? Why treat prisoners as colleagues rather than simply as sources of labor? The only logical explanation was that American medical culture prioritized patient outcomes over political considerations. This pragmatic approach to expertise extended throughout the camp system. Japanese women with teaching backgrounds found themselves helping to organize educational activities. Those with administrative experience were assigned to clerical duties that actually mattered. Former nurses were given real medical responsibilities that affected patient care. The Americans seemed genuinely interested in utilizing whatever skills prisoners possessed, regardless of their national origin or enemy status. Competence was valued for its own sake, not as a reflection of political loyalty or cultural background. This meritocratic approach was revolutionary to women raised in a system where social position often mattered more than actual ability. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating discovery was still to come. Because on the sixth day, they witnessed something that destroyed their last attempts to maintain their old worldview. They saw American soldiers being disciplined by their own officers. It happened during a routine inspection when a sergeant discovered that one of his men had been trading cigarettes with Japanese prisoners in exchange for small handicrafts. The violation was minor, more about maintaining proper boundaries than preventing serious misconduct. But the response was swift and professional. The soldier was called before his commanding officer, formally reprimanded, and assigned additional duties as punishment. The entire process was conducted according to established military justice procedures, with witnesses present and proper documentation maintained. It was bureaucratic, official, and completely transparent. What shocked the Japanese women wasn't the punishment itself, but the systematic nature of American military discipline. These soldiers were held accountable to the same standards they applied to others. Rules weren't just imposed on enemies or subordinates. They applied universally, regardless of rank or nationality. This revelation struck at the heart of their understanding of American character. They had been told that Americans were fundamentally lawless, governed only by greed and violence. Yet here was evidence of a military culture that valued rule of law even when it meant punishing their own personnel for minor infractions. The contrast with Japanese military culture was stark. They had witnessed Japanese officers commit acts that would have resulted in severe punishment under American military justice. Yet those same officers faced no consequences because their actions were directed against enemies or subordinates rather than peers. This observation forced them to confront uncomfortable questions about their own military system. If American forces maintained higher standards of conduct toward enemies than Japanese forces maintained toward their own personnel, what did that say about relative levels of civilization and military professionalism. The questions multiplied when they realized that American military justice included provisions for protecting prisoners from abuse. Guards who mistreated captives faced court-martial proceedings. Officers who failed to maintain proper prisoner care standards were relieved of command. The system included checks and balances designed to prevent exactly the kind of atrocities that Japanese propaganda claimed were standard American practice. Some of the women began to wonder if the stories they had heard about American brutality in other theaters might have been exaggerated or fabricated entirely. If American military culture actually emphasized restraint and professional conduct, how could the systematic atrocities described in Japanese media be accurate? These doubts were reinforced by their daily interactions with American personnel. Guards who were consistently professional rather than cruel. Medical staff who provided genuine care rather than conducting experiments. Officers who followed established procedures rather than indulging in arbitrary violence. Every day brought new evidence that contradicted the propaganda they had believed. Every interaction demonstrated that American military culture was based on systematic professionalism rather than chaotic brutality. Every procedure showed that prisoners were protected by regulations rather than subject to unlimited abuse. The psychological impact was overwhelming. These women had prepared for martyrdom in service of resistance against savage enemies. Instead, they found themselves being treated better than they had often been treated by their own military hierarchy. The enemy they had been taught to hate was showing them more systematic consideration than they had received from the forces they had been taught to revere. This realization created an impossible emotional situation. How could you maintain hatred for people who were treating you with professional courtesy? How could you preserve loyalty to a system that had prepared you for death while your supposed enemies were working to keep you alive and healthy? Some prisoners struggled desperately to maintain their old beliefs. They convinced themselves that American kindness was temporary, that the real brutality would emerge later. They interpreted every minor inconvenience as evidence that their captors' true nature would eventually be revealed. They clung to propaganda explanations, even when daily experience contradicted them, but others began to accept the evidence before their eyes. They started to acknowledge that everything they had been told about American character might have been wrong. They began to question not just enemy propaganda, but their own government's claims about the nature of the war itself. If Americans weren't the monsters described in Japanese media, what justified the desperate resistance that had cost so many Japanese lives? If the enemy was capable of showing systematic mercy and following international law, what did that mean about Japanese claims of moral superiority? These questions led to even deeper doubts about the information they had received throughout the war. If their government had lied about American character, what else might have been false? If enemy forces were more professional and humanitarian than they had been told, what did that suggest about their own side's conduct? The women found themselves caught between loyalty to everything they had believed and evidence that contradicted their most fundamental assumptions. Some would never resolve this conflict, carrying the psychological tension for the rest of their lives. Others would eventually conclude that they had been deceived about nearly everything related to the war and its participants. But all of them understood that they had witnessed something that changed them permanently. They had seen proof that their enemies were more humane than their own propaganda had claimed. They had experienced treatment from foreign captors that exceeded what they had often received from their own military authorities. This knowledge would travel with them wherever they went after the war ended. It would influence their understanding of international relations, cultural differences, and the nature of propaganda itself. Most importantly, it would serve as permanent evidence that the world was far more complex and morally ambiguous than wartime simplicities had suggested. The shock of discovery was just beginning, because what they had learned about American military culture was only one aspect of a broader revelation about alternative approaches to organizing society, treating individuals, and conducting international relations that would continue to unfold as their captivity extended into weeks and months. The weeks that followed brought revelations that went beyond military procedure and into something far more profound. Because what these Japanese women discovered next would challenge not just their understanding of American soldiers, but their entire conception of what human society could look like. It started with something so simple, it almost escaped notice. A guard sharing his lunch with a prisoner's sick child. Not because regulations required it, but because he noticed the child looked hungry. The gesture lasted maybe 30 seconds. The guard broke his sandwich in half, handed the larger piece to the little girl, and walked away without expecting thanks or recognition. To women raised in a culture where every act of kindness carried social obligation, this casual generosity was bewildering. There was no ceremony, no formal presentation, no expectation of gratitude that would create lasting debt. Just one human being noticing another's need and responding naturally. But it wasn't an isolated incident. These small acts of spontaneous kindness appeared everywhere once the women started looking for them. A medic who spent his own break time teaching origami to bored children in the medical tent. A cook who saved extra portions for pregnant prisoners without being asked. A clerk who helped illiterate women write letters home during his off-duty hours. None of these actions were required by military regulations. None were ordered by superior officers. None were performed for recognition or reward. They emerged from what appeared to be genuine human impulse toward compassion, unfiltered by bureaucracy or ideology. The psychological impact was devastating because it revealed something the Japanese women hadn't expected to find in their enemies: individual moral agency, the ability to choose kindness even when institutional structures didn't demand it, personal character that operated independently of orders, propaganda, or social pressure. This discovery forced them to confront uncomfortable questions about their own moral development. When had they last acted purely from compassion rather than obligation? When had they chosen kindness that wasn't socially required or politically beneficial? When had they exercised moral judgment that contradicted official expectations? The questions became more complex when they observed how American personnel handled moral conflicts between regulations and human needs. A nurse who bent rules to provide extra medical attention to a critically ill prisoner. A guard who looked the other way when family members hugged goodbye longer than officially permitted. An officer who found creative interpretations of orders to allow prisoners small comforts that weren't technically authorized. These weren't acts of rebellion against military discipline. They were examples of people using judgment and discretion to balance competing moral obligations, following orders while maintaining humanity, respecting authority while preserving individual conscience. The concept was revolutionary to women who had been taught that moral virtue lay in absolute obedience to hierarchical authority. They had learned that questioning orders was inherently wrong, that individual conscience was dangerous, that personal judgment was inferior to institutional wisdom. Yet here was evidence that moral maturity might actually require the ability to balance competing obligations. That blind obedience might sometimes conflict with genuine virtue. That individual conscience might serve as a necessary check on institutional power. The implications extended far beyond military culture. If American society produced people capable of independent moral judgment, what kind of educational system had created them? What kind of family structures had shaped their character development? What kind of cultural values had taught them to balance individual conscience with collective responsibility? The women began paying closer attention to how Americans talked about their backgrounds, their families, their reasons for serving. What they discovered challenged every assumption they held about enemy society and values. Many American soldiers spoke openly about disagreeing with their parents about career choices, political opinions, even participation in the war itself. Some had joined the military against family wishes. Others had chosen their assignments based on personal conviction rather than social expectation. Many expressed complex feelings about their role in combat that included doubt, regret, and moral questioning. This open acknowledgement of internal conflict was stunning to women raised in a culture that prized harmonious agreement within families and communities. They had been taught that public expression of doubt or disagreement indicated weakness and disloyalty. Yet these Americans seemed to view such discussions as natural and healthy. Even more shocking was how American authorities responded to expressions of doubt or questioning. Rather than punishment or re-education, there seemed to be acceptance that intelligent people might have complex feelings about difficult situations. Chaplains were available for counseling. Officers encouraged soldiers to discuss their concerns. Mental health was treated as a legitimate military concern rather than a character flaw. This systematic support for individual psychological welfare was unlike anything the Japanese women had experienced in their own military service. They had been expected to suppress doubt, ignore psychological stress, and maintain perfect emotional discipline regardless of circumstances. Personal struggles were seen as selfish indulgence that weakened collective effectiveness. The contrast became even more apparent when they observed how Americans handled what they called battle fatigue. Soldiers showing signs of psychological stress were treated medically rather than disciplinarily. They received counseling, rest, sometimes even reassignment to less stressful duties. The assumption seemed to be that psychological health was essential for long-term military effectiveness. This pragmatic approach to human limitations was profoundly different from Japanese military culture, which treated psychological breakdown as moral failure requiring shame and punishment. The idea that acknowledging human weakness might actually strengthen rather than weaken military performance was revolutionary. But perhaps the most psychologically challenging discovery came when the women realized that American military culture included systematic provisions for conscientious objection. Some personnel served in non-combat roles because their religious or moral beliefs prevented them from directly participating in violence. These individuals weren't punished or scorned. They were assigned to medical, administrative, or support duties that utilized their skills while respecting their convictions. The very existence of institutionalized conscientious objection challenged fundamental assumptions about military service and patriotic duty. How could a nation at war accommodate soldiers who refused to fight? How could military effectiveness be maintained if individual conscience was allowed to override strategic necessity? Yet somehow the American military seemed to function efficiently, while including provisions for moral dissent. Personnel who couldn't participate in combat still contributed to overall mission success through alternative service. Their moral convictions were treated as legitimate rather than treasonous. This tolerance for moral complexity within military ranks suggested a society comfortable with individual differences, capable of accommodating diverse approaches to patriotic service, confident enough to allow questioning without fearing institutional collapse. The women began to understand that what they were witnessing wasn't just military efficiency or professional courtesy. It was evidence of a fundamentally different approach to organizing human relationships. A system that assumed individual moral agency was valuable rather than dangerous. A culture that treated personal conscience as a resource to be cultivated rather than a threat to be suppressed. These realizations led to even more disturbing questions about their own society. If individual moral judgment could coexist with institutional effectiveness, what justified the rigid conformity they had known at home? If questioning and dissent could actually strengthen rather than weaken collective performance, what was the real purpose of demanding absolute obedience? The psychological revolution was accelerating beyond their ability to control or resist. Every day brought new evidence that alternative approaches to human organization were not only possible, but potentially superior to what they had experienced. Every interaction demonstrated that respect for individual dignity could coexist with collective effectiveness. some prisoners tried desperately to maintain their old worldview by explaining away what they observed. American individualism was selfish and ultimately weak, they told themselves. This apparent freedom would collapse under serious pressure. These accommodations for personal conscience were luxuries that a truly threatened nation couldn't afford. But the explanations became harder to sustain as evidence accumulated. These supposedly weak individualists had just defeated Japanese forces across the Pacific. Their allegedly selfish system had produced military effectiveness that exceeded anything achieved through rigid conformity. Their accommodation of dissent had created stronger rather than weaker institutional performance. The women found themselves forced to consider possibilities that challenged everything they thought they knew about human nature and social organization. Maybe individual freedom enhanced rather than threatened collective strength. Maybe respect for personal conscience produced better decisions than blind obedience. Maybe societies that trusted their members' judgment were more resilient than those that demanded unquestioning compliance. These were dangerous thoughts that could reshape their understanding of their own country's failures and their enemy's success. Thoughts that could make return to their old lives psychologically impossible. Thoughts that could transform them into strangers in their own homeland. But the thoughts came anyway, triggered by daily exposure to a functioning alternative system. A system that seemed to produce both individual dignity and collective effectiveness. A system that challenged every assumption they had held about the necessary trade-offs between personal freedom and social order. The shock of recognition was spreading beyond military culture into fundamental questions about human potential, social possibility, and the very nature of civilization itself. What they were discovering wasn't just that Americans were different from what they had expected. What they were discovering was that everything they thought they knew about how human societies had to work might be wrong. And that realization, once it took hold, would change not just their understanding of their enemies, but their understanding of themselves, their country, and the world they would eventually return to when this impossible captivity finally ended. The transformation was irreversible. The questions once raised couldn't be unasked. The evidence once seen couldn't be unseen. These women were becoming living contradictions to everything their homeland believed about human nature, enemy character, and the requirements of civilized society. They were discovering that the world was far larger, far more complex, and far more hopeful than anyone had ever told them, and that discovery would travel with them wherever they went for the rest of their lives. The transformation deepened when they witnessed something that broke their understanding of power itself. It happened during what Americans called a town hall meeting. Guards had gathered prisoners in a large tent to discuss camp conditions, complaints, and potential improvements. But here's what made their minds reel. The Americans were actually listening, not just pretending to listen while dismissing concerns, but genuinely considering prisoner feedback and implementing changes based on their suggestions. When women complained about overcrowded sleeping arrangements, additional tents appeared within days. When they requested different meal schedules to accommodate religious practices, the kitchen staff adjusted their routines. When they asked for more time to write letters home, the daily schedule was modified to include extended correspondence periods. This wasn't token consultation designed to create the illusion of participation. This was actual power sharing between captors and captives, something so unprecedented that many prisoners initially refused to speak up, convinced it had to be some elaborate trap. One woman later described the moment when she realized her words actually mattered. She had mentioned that the soap provided for washing was too harsh for children's skin. 3 days later, Malder soap appeared specifically for families with young children. The speed and specificity of the response shattered her assumptions about how authority functioned. In her experience, power flowed in one direction only. Superiors issued orders, subordinates obeyed without question, and the idea that those at the bottom of hierarchies could influence those at the top was not just unlikely, but dangerous to even imagine. Yet here were American officers actively seeking input from enemy prisoners and treating their suggestions as valuable intelligence about improving operations. The psychological impact was staggering because it revealed something about American culture that propaganda had never prepared them for. The assumption that good ideas could come from anywhere, that wisdom wasn't monopolized by rank or authority, that systems improved when they incorporated feedback from all participants. This participatory approach extended throughout the camp structure. Prisoners were asked to help design work schedules that balanced productivity with health concerns. They were consulted about food preparation methods that could accommodate different dietary restrictions. They were even invited to suggest recreational activities that might improve morale without compromising security. The very concept of consulting enemies about their own captivity was mind-bending. Why would victorious forces care about the comfort and opinions of defeated opponents? Why invest time and energy in accommodating the preferences of people who had recently been trying to kill you? The only logical explanation was that American military culture operated on fundamentally different assumptions about human worth and dignity. These weren't just procedural differences or tactical variations. They represented an entirely different philosophy about the value of individual human experience and the importance of treating all people, even enemies, as beings whose thoughts and feelings mattered. This realization forced the women to confront uncomfortable truths about their own military's treatment of prisoners, civilians, and even their own personnel. When had Japanese authorities ever asked for their input on policies that affected their lives? When had their concerns about working conditions, food quality, or family contact been treated as legitimate rather than selfish complaints? The contrast became even sharper when they observed how American officers handled disagreements among themselves. Rather than rigid hierarchy, where junior officers remained silent while seniors made all decisions, they witnessed actual debates where different viewpoints were presented, discussed, and sometimes incorporated into final plans. These weren't quiet private consultations conducted away from subordinates' eyes. These were open professional discussions where experience and expertise mattered more than rank alone. Junior officers with relevant knowledge could influence senior officers' decisions. Enlisted personnel with specialized skills could affect strategic planning. Merit and competence created authority that complemented rather than challenged formal hierarchy. The efficiency this produced was remarkable. Problems were identified quickly because information flowed upward freely. Solutions were implemented effectively because they incorporated insights from multiple perspectives. Morale remained high because everyone felt their expertise was valued and their contributions recognized. But this collaborative approach to leadership created its own psychological earthquake for women raised in authoritarian systems. They had been taught that questioning authority was inherently destructive, that multiple perspectives created confusion and weakness, that effective leadership required absolute deference from subordinates. Yet here was proof that exactly the opposite might be true, that organizations encouraging questions and debate might make better decisions than those demanding blind obedience, that leaders who listened to criticism might be more effective than those who insisted on unchallenged authority. The implications extended far beyond military organization into fundamental questions about human potential and social development. If American society produced people capable of contributing constructive criticism to their superiors, what kind of educational system had shaped them? What kind of family structures had taught them to balance respect with independent thinking? They began noticing how American personnel talked about their backgrounds, their schooling, their family relationships. What emerged was a picture of a society that encouraged children to ask questions, rewarded curiosity over compliance, and treated intellectual independence as a virtue rather than a threat. Many Americans described educational experiences that emphasized critical thinking over memorization, debate over recitation, problem solving over rule following. They spoke of teachers who encouraged students to challenge textbook information, parents who welcomed disagreement during family discussions, communities that valued innovation over tradition. This approach to human development was revolutionary to women educated in systems that prized conformity, discouraged questioning, and treated intellectual submission as moral virtue. They had learned that wisdom came from accepting established truths rather than examining them, that good citizens followed guidance rather than developing independent judgment. The contrast became even more apparent when Americans described their relationships with authority figures. Many spoke casually about disagreeing with parents, teachers, even government officials. Some had chosen careers against family wishes, moved to different regions despite community pressure, made life decisions based on personal conviction rather than social expectation. This individual autonomy wasn't presented as rebellion or selfishness, but as natural personal development. Americans seemed to assume that mature adults would make independent decisions, that healthy relationships could accommodate disagreement, that social stability was enhanced rather than threatened by individual freedom. The very existence of such attitudes challenged everything the women had been taught about social harmony and collective responsibility. How could societies function if individuals prioritized personal conviction over group consensus? How could families maintain unity if members felt free to pursue different paths? How could communities preserve stability if people challenged established wisdom? Yet somehow, American society had produced military forces capable of conquering Japanese territory while maintaining systems that encouraged, rather than suppressed, individual initiative. Their allegedly chaotic individualism had generated organizational effectiveness that exceeded anything achieved through rigid conformity. The women found themselves forced to consider possibilities that contradicted their most basic assumptions about human nature and social organization. Maybe individual freedom created stronger rather than weaker communities. Maybe societies that trusted their members' judgment were more resilient than those demanding unquestioning obedience. Maybe diversity of thought produced better outcomes than enforced uniformity. These realizations created profound psychological tension because they suggested that everything they had sacrificed for might have been unnecessary. The conformity they had embraced, the questions they had suppressed, the independence they had abandoned in service of social harmony, all of it might have been counterproductive rather than virtuous. Some prisoners struggled desperately to maintain their old worldview by finding flaws in what they observed. American individualism was ultimately selfish, they told themselves. This apparent freedom would collapse under serious pressure. These accommodations for personal opinion were luxuries that a truly threatened society couldn't afford. But the explanations became increasingly difficult to sustain as evidence accumulated. These supposedly selfish individualists had just demonstrated military superiority across the Pacific theater. Their allegedly unstable system had produced technological innovation, organizational effectiveness, and strategic success that exceeded anything achieved through centralized control. The psychological revolution was accelerating beyond their ability to resist or control. Every day brought new proof that alternative approaches to human organization were not only possible, but demonstrably superior in practical outcomes. Every interaction provided evidence that respect for individual dignity enhanced rather than undermined collective performance. The most disturbing aspect wasn't just that Americans were different from what they had expected. The most disturbing aspect was that American approaches to organizing human relationships seemed to produce better results than the systems they had been taught were naturally superior. This recognition struck at the heart of their cultural identity and national pride. If enemy methods were more effective than their own, what did that say about Japanese claims of cultural superiority? If foreign approaches to education, family life, and social organization produced stronger individuals and more capable societies, what justified their loyalty to traditional ways? The questions multiplied faster than answers, creating cognitive dissonance that would persist long after their captivity ended. These women were becoming living contradictions to their homeland's most fundamental beliefs about human nature, social organization, and cultural superiority. They were witnesses to possibilities their own society had never allowed them to imagine. Proof that the world contained alternatives to everything they had accepted as natural and inevitable. Evidence that human potential could be developed in ways that enhanced both individual dignity and collective effectiveness. The shock of these discoveries would travel with them wherever they went for the rest of their lives, creating permanent questions about the society they would return to and the assumptions that had shaped their understanding of human possibility. But the revelations weren't finished, because what they had learned about American approaches to authority and individual dignity was just one aspect of a broader system that would continue challenging their worldview in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The transformation was irreversible, the questions unstoppable, the evidence undeniable. These women were becoming bridges between two incompatible ways of understanding human potential, carrying knowledge that would make them forever strangers to the certainties they had once embraced, and the most shocking discoveries were still to come. The seventh week brought something that would shatter their final illusions about American society forever. It started with an argument between two American nurses that the Japanese women witnessed by accident. The disagreement was about patient care protocols. One nurse believed a particular treatment approach was outdated and potentially harmful. The other defended the established procedure as time-tested and reliable. What followed was a heated professional debate that lasted nearly an hour. But here's what made the Japanese women's jaws drop. Neither nurse was punished for disagreeing. Neither was disciplined for challenging established protocols. Neither was forced to submit to the other's authority, simply based on seniority or rank. Instead, they consulted medical literature. They brought in a third nurse for her opinion. They even asked one of the Japanese prisoners, a former nurse herself, what techniques had been used in Japanese hospitals. The debate concluded with a decision to test both approaches and evaluate the results objectively. To women raised in a culture where public disagreement was shameful and challenging authority was dangerous, this open conflict resolution was absolutely mind-blowing. These American women were treating professional disagreement as a normal part of improving patient care, rather than as a threat to institutional order. The implications hit like a thunderbolt. If American society allowed and even encouraged such debates, what kind of progress might be possible? If people could challenge established methods without fear of punishment, how much innovation could emerge? If disagreement was treated as a tool for improvement, rather than a sign of disloyalty, what problems could be solved? The psychological shock deepened when they realized this wasn't an isolated incident. Everywhere they looked, Americans were engaging in casual debates about everything from baseball statistics to cooking techniques to the best methods for maintaining equipment. Disagreement wasn't avoided or suppressed. It was embraced as natural human interaction. Guards would argue good-naturedly about which American cities had the best restaurants. Medics would debate the merits of different medical schools they had attended. Officers would discuss tactical approaches with the enthusiasm of people who genuinely enjoyed intellectual challenge. None of these debates created lasting animosity or damaged professional relationships. People could disagree strongly about ideas while maintaining personal respect and friendship. The ability to separate intellectual conflict from personal antagonism was a skill that seemed as natural to Americans as breathing. This capacity for constructive disagreement revealed something profound about American character formation. These people had been raised in environments where questioning and debate were encouraged rather than punished. They had learned to see intellectual challenge as a sign of engagement rather than disrespect. The contrast with Japanese social norms was absolute. The women had been taught that harmony required avoiding disagreement, that wisdom came from accepting established truths, that questioning authorities was inherently destructive to social order. Yet here was proof that societies could function effectively while encouraging rather than suppressing intellectual conflict. The revelation became even more devastating when they observed how Americans handled mistakes and failures. When a medic made an error in patient treatment, the response wasn't punishment or shame. It was analysis, discussion, and systematic efforts to prevent similar mistakes in the future. The medic who made the error was asked to explain what had happened, not for punishment, but for learning. Other medical personnel discussed how procedures could be improved to prevent similar problems. The entire incident became a teaching opportunity rather than an occasion for blame and humiliation. This approach to human error was revolutionary to women who had been raised in a culture where mistakes brought shame not just to individuals, but to their entire families. They had learned to hide failures, deny problems, and avoid taking risks that might lead to visible errors. Yet Americans seem to treat mistakes as inevitable aspects of human nature that could be managed through systematic learning, rather than moral failing that required punishment. The assumption appeared to be that people would perform better when they could admit errors openly, rather than when they were forced to conceal problems to avoid shame. The practical results were extraordinary. Medical care improved because problems were identified and addressed quickly. Equipment maintenance was more effective because personnel could report malfunctions without fear of blame. Training programs were refined because instructors received honest feedback about what worked and what didn't. This systematic approach to learning from failure produced continuous improvement in ways that punishment-based systems couldn't match. Organizations got better because they incorporated lessons from mistakes, rather than simply punishing people for making them. But the psychological implications went far deeper than organizational effectiveness. If American society had taught people to view failure as a learning opportunity, rather than a moral catastrophe, what kind of individuals would such an approach produce? What kind of innovation and progress would be possible in cultures that encouraged, rather than punished, risk-taking? The women began to understand that what they were witnessing wasn't just different military procedures or alternative organizational methods. They were seeing evidence of a fundamentally different approach to human development and social progress. American culture seemed designed to maximize individual potential by creating environments where people could experiment, fail, learn, and improve without fear of catastrophic social consequences. This approach appeared to produce both personal resilience and collective advancement in ways that rigid conformity couldn't achieve. The realization was psychologically devastating because it suggested that their own society's approach to human development might be actively counterproductive. The shame-based systems that were supposed to encourage excellence might actually inhibit the kind of risk-taking and experimentation that led to genuine improvement. Some prisoners tried desperately to find flaws in what they observed. American tolerance for failure would lead to low standards, they told themselves. This acceptance of mistakes would produce sloppy performance. These debates and disagreements would eventually tear their society apart. But the evidence suggested exactly the opposite. American military performance was superior to Japanese effectiveness despite, or perhaps because of, their willingness to question established methods and learn from failures. Their allegedly chaotic system of open debate was producing better practical results than rigid hierarchical decision-making. The psychological revolution was entering its final phase as fundamental assumptions about human nature and social organization collapsed under the weight of contradictory evidence. Every day brought new proof that alternative approaches to organizing human relationships were not only possible, but demonstrably more effective. The most shocking aspect wasn't just that Americans were different from what they had expected. The most shocking aspect was that American methods seemed to produce better outcomes across every measurable dimension of performance and human welfare. These discoveries were creating permanent changes in how the women understood themselves, their country, and human possibility itself. They were becoming living proof that their homeland's most cherished beliefs about cultural superiority and social organization might be fundamentally wrong. The transformation was irreversible because it was based on direct observation rather than propaganda or theory. They had seen with their own eyes that respect for individual dignity, tolerance for disagreement, and systematic learning from failure could coexist with military effectiveness and social stability. More importantly, they had experienced personally what it felt like to live in a system that valued their input, respected their expertise, and treated their welfare as important regardless of their enemy status. They knew from direct experience that alternative approaches to human organization could produce both personal dignity and collective effectiveness. This knowledge would travel with them back to Japan, creating permanent questions about the society they would rejoin. They would become living contradictions to their homeland's assumptions about human nature, cultural superiority, and the requirements of social order. Some would spend the rest of their lives trying to reconcile what they had experienced with loyalty to their country and culture. Others would become quiet advocates for changes that might bring some of the benefits they had witnessed to Japanese society. All would carry memories of a time when they had been treated as human beings, whose thoughts, feelings, and contributions mattered, even by people who had every reason to consider them enemies. These memories would serve as permanent proof that the world contained possibilities their own society had never allowed them to imagine. The 8th week brought the most psychologically destructive revelation of all. It happened when they witnessed something so impossible, so contrary to everything they believed about human nature, that some women initially refused to believe their own eyes. They saw American soldiers weeping, not from physical pain or combat wounds, but from emotional grief over the death of a Japanese child in the medical tent. A little girl who had been sick when her family was captured had finally succumbed despite weeks of American medical care. When she died, several of the American medics who had been treating her broke down in tears. These weren't crocodile tears or theatrical displays. These were genuine expressions of grief from enemy soldiers mourning the death of a child from a nation they were fighting against. The contradiction was so complete that it shattered the last remnants of wartime propaganda about American heartlessness and racial hatred. One nurse later described watching an American doctor sit by the child's bedside for hours after her death, holding her small hand and speaking softly in English words the family couldn't understand, but whose meaning was universally clear. He was saying goodbye, expressing sorrow, acknowledging the loss of a life that had mattered to him personally, despite her nationality. The funeral arrangements that followed were even more shocking. American personnel organized a proper burial service that incorporated both Christian and Buddhist elements. They had consulted with Japanese prisoners about appropriate rituals and had obtained materials for traditional funeral practices. Enemy soldiers were conducting religious ceremonies for the child of people they were supposed to hate. The mother was allowed to participate fully in the service, supported by American nurses who had worked alongside her to care for the dying girl. The father, despite being a prisoner of war, was treated with the dignity due to a grieving parent rather than the contempt expected for a defeated enemy. This display of cross-cultural compassion revealed something about American character that no amount of propaganda could have prepared them for: the capacity to see shared humanity even across the boundaries of warfare, nationalism, and racial difference. The ability to grieve genuinely for the suffering of people designated as enemies. The psychological impact was devastating because it destroyed the last intellectual defense against recognizing American humanity. These people weren't just more organized or better equipped than expected. They weren't just following superior military procedures or implementing more effective policies. They were demonstrating moral depth and emotional capacity that exceeded what the Japanese women had often witnessed in their own communities. The revelation became even more profound when they realized this compassion extended throughout American military culture. They had observed countless small acts of kindness, but they had explained them away as procedures or policies designed to maintain order and efficiency. The grief over the Japanese child's death couldn't be explained as anything other than genuine human emotion. This recognition forced them to confront the most disturbing question of all. If Americans were capable of such authentic compassion toward enemy civilians, what did that say about the nature of the war itself? If these supposedly savage beasts could weep over the death of a Japanese child, what justified the brutal resistance that had cost so many lives on both sides? The implications spread like psychological poison through every assumption they had held about the conflict. They had been taught that they were fighting a war between civilization and barbarism, between human beings and monsters, between moral people and savage beasts who understood only violence and greed. But monsters don't weep over the deaths of enemy children. Savage beasts don't organize interfaith funeral services for the families of their captives. Morally empty materialists don't risk their own emotional well-being by forming attachments to people they're supposed to consider subhuman. The Americans they were observing displayed the kind of moral sensitivity and emotional depth that their own propaganda had claimed was uniquely Japanese. The capacity for genuine compassion, the ability to see beyond surface differences to shared humanity, the willingness to extend kindness even to those designated as enemies. This recognition created an impossible psychological situation. If both sides of the war were capable of such humanity, what had the fighting been about? If Americans could demonstrate the same moral qualities that Japanese propaganda claimed as exclusively Asian virtues, what justified the racial superiority theories that had driven the conflict? Some prisoners struggled desperately to maintain their old worldview by explaining away what they had witnessed. The Americans were manipulating them emotionally, they told themselves. This display of grief was calculated to lower their guard and make them more compliant. The funeral service was propaganda designed to show other prisoners how well treated they would be if they cooperated. But the explanations became impossible to sustain because the grief was too authentic, the compassion too consistent, the kindness too widespread to be mere manipulation. These Americans were genuinely moved by human suffering, regardless of nationality, genuinely committed to treating all people with basic dignity, regardless of enemy status. The women found themselves forced to acknowledge that they had been fighting people who were fundamentally similar to themselves, people capable of love, grief, compassion, and moral growth. People who formed emotional attachments to others regardless of racial or national boundaries. People who could recognize shared humanity even in the midst of warfare. This recognition destroyed the intellectual foundations that had made the war psychologically bearable. It was possible to fight monsters without moral complexity. It was possible to resist savage beasts without questioning the righteousness of your cause. But it was impossible to maintain hatred for people who demonstrated the same capacity for love and grief that you possessed yourself. The psychological transformation was complete. These women could no longer see Americans as fundamentally different from or inferior to themselves. They could no longer maintain beliefs about racial superiority or cultural supremacy. They could no longer justify the hatred that had sustained their resistance. Instead, they were forced to confront the possibility that the entire war had been a tragedy of misunderstanding, propaganda, and political manipulation rather than a necessary struggle between fundamentally incompatible peoples. They were forced to consider that both sides might have been victims of leaders who prioritized power over human welfare. The implications extended far beyond their personal beliefs into questions about the nature of nationalism, the reliability of government information, and the moral responsibility of individuals who participate in conflicts they don't fully understand. If they had been wrong about American character, what else might they have been wrong about? These questions would haunt them for the rest of their lives, creating permanent doubt about the reliability of official information and the wisdom of blindly following political authority. They had learned through direct experience that propaganda could be completely false, that enemies could be more humane than portrayed. that wars could be fought between people who had no fundamental reason to hate each other. The knowledge was liberating and terrifying simultaneously. Liberating because it opened possibilities for human understanding and cooperation that they had never imagined. Terrifying because it suggested that much of their lives had been shaped by lies and that many of the sacrifices they had made had been unnecessary. Some would never fully recover from this psychological revolution. The contradiction between what they had believed and what they had experienced would create permanent tension between loyalty to their homeland and recognition of universal human dignity. They would spend decades trying to reconcile love of country with knowledge that their country had been wrong about fundamental questions of human nature and international relations. Others would find ways to incorporate their new understanding into broader perspectives on human possibility and social progress. They would become quiet advocates for international understanding, cross-cultural communication, and the kind of education that might prevent future generations from falling victim to the same propaganda and misunderstanding. All would carry permanent memories of a time when they had been treated with dignity by people they had been taught to hate, when they had witnessed compassion from those designated as enemies, when they had experienced humanity from those described as monsters. These memories would serve as lifelong proof that the world contained more love, understanding, and moral possibility than political leaders on any side typically acknowledged. The shock of recognition was complete. They had discovered that their enemies were human beings, capable of the same love, grief, and moral depth that they possessed themselves. This discovery would reshape their understanding of warfare, nationalism, and human nature for the rest of their lives. But perhaps most importantly, it would give them hope that if such understanding was possible between enemies in wartime, even greater cooperation might be possible between peoples during times of peace. The compassion they had witnessed suggested that human nature contained resources for building bridges across any divide, no matter how deep the apparent differences. That hope would travel with them back to Japan and into the future, carrying the possibility that their shocking discoveries might contribute to a world where such misunderstandings and conflicts became less likely, where people could recognize shared humanity before rather than after devastating wars, where the kind of compassion they had witnessed could flourish in peace as well as emerge from the ashes of conflict. The transformation was complete, irreversible, and permanent. These women would never again be able to see the world through the simple categories of friend and enemy, superior and inferior, us and them that had once shaped their understanding. They had been shocked into a broader, more complex, and ultimately more hopeful vision of human possibility, and that shock would echo through their lives and the lives of everyone they touched, carrying the seeds of understanding that might help prevent future generations from experiencing the same tragic misunderstandings that had shaped their own wartime ordeal. The 9th week shattered something even deeper than their understanding of American character. It destroyed their faith in everything they thought they knew about truth itself. It started when they were allowed to listen to American radio broadcasts, not propaganda directed at prisoners, but actual news programs intended for American soldiers. What they heard made their blood run cold, not because of American cruelty, but because of American honesty about their own failures and mistakes. The radio announcers discussed American military setbacks with the same matter-of-fact tone they used for victories. They reported on equipment failures, tactical errors, even cases where American commanders had made poor decisions that cost lives. They criticized their own government's policies, questioned strategic choices, and openly debated whether certain military operations had been worth their human cost. To women raised on a steady diet of glorious victory reports and heroic sacrifice narratives, this casual acknowledgement of failure and error was psychologically devastating. Where were the triumphant declarations of inevitable victory? Where were the claims of divine protection and racial superiority? Where was the absolute certainty that their cause was righteous and their methods perfect? Instead, They heard American soldiers calling in to radio shows to complain about poor leadership, inadequate supplies, and strategic decisions they disagreed with. They heard broadcasters interviewing families who had lost sons and allowed them to express anger, grief, and even criticism of the war effort itself. The contrast with Japanese media could not have been more complete. Every heroic deaths and the absolute Japanese radio broadcasts they remembered had emphasized glorious victories. Righteousness of their cause. Defeat was never acknowledged, mistakes were never admitted, and questioning the wisdom of leadership was unthinkable. Yet somehow this nation that allowed such open criticism and doubt had managed to defeat Japanese forces across the Pacific. Their willingness to acknowledge problems and debate solutions hadn't weakened them. If anything, it seemed to have made them stronger by allowing them to identify and correct errors rather than pretending they didn't exist. The psychological implications were staggering. If American success was built on honest self-assessment rather than blind faith, what did that say about Japanese methods? If admitting mistakes led to better performance than denying them, what did that mean about the culture of infallibility they had been raised to revere? But the radio broadcasts revealed something even more disturbing. American news programs included reports from Japanese sources, including intercepted communications and captured documents. These reports described Japanese military operations with an accuracy that was terrifying in its precision. The Americans knew exactly what Japanese forces were doing, where they were positioned, and what their strategic objectives were. They had intelligence networks that penetrated deep into Japanese operations, providing real-time information that made successful resistance nearly impossible. Yet Japanese radio broadcasts had consistently claimed that American intelligence was poor, that their enemy was stumbling blindly through the Pacific, that Japanese tactical superiority was constantly catching them off guard. The women realized with growing horror that their own side had been lying not just about American character, but about American capabilities. This recognition led to an even more disturbing realization. If Japanese authorities had been wrong about American intelligence capabilities, what else had they been wrong about? If their assessments of enemy strength, strategy, and effectiveness were completely inaccurate, how could any of their other claims be trusted? The questions multiplied when they heard American broadcasts discussing Japanese civilian conditions. The reports described food shortages, bombing damage, and civilian casualties with details that could only have come from extensive intelligence operations within Japan itself. These weren't the exaggerated propaganda claims they had expected from enemy broadcasts. These were sober, factual assessments that matched what the women knew about conditions in their homeland before their capture. The Americans understood Japanese civilian suffering better than Japanese authorities acknowledged it publicly. The contrast was devastating. American radio openly discussed the human cost of their own military operations, including civilian casualties caused by bombing raids on Japanese cities. They debated the ethics of strategic bombing, questioned whether targeting civilian populations was morally justified, and allowed critics to argue that such tactics were counterproductive. Meanwhile, Japanese broadcasts had consistently denied that American bombing was causing significant civilian casualties, claimed that Japanese cities were adequately defended, and insisted that civilian morale remained unshakable despite clear evidence to the contrary. Which version was true? The American broadcasts that acknowledged difficult realities and moral complexities, or the Japanese reports that claimed everything was going according to plan, despite mounting evidence of catastrophic failure? The answer became unavoidable when they heard an American news report about the very battle where many of them had been captured. The broadcast described Japanese defensive positions with perfect accuracy, identified specific units by name, and even mentioned individual commanders who had been killed or captured. But more importantly, the American report acknowledged that Japanese resistance had been fierce and that American casualties had been higher than expected. They praised the courage of Japanese defenders, expressed sympathy for civilian populations caught in the fighting and admitted that victory had been more costly than anticipated. This honest assessment of enemy capabilities and the true cost of victory was unlike anything they had ever heard from their own media. Japanese broadcasts would have claimed glorious victory regardless of actual outcomes, minimized their own casualties while exaggerating enemy losses, and portrayed any resistance as proof of inevitable triumph. The psychological impact was overwhelming because it forced them to confront the possibility that everything they had believed about the war might have been fabricated. Not just enemy character or capabilities, but basic facts about battles, casualties, strategic situations, and prospects for victory. If American media was more honest about Japanese military performance than Japanese media was, what did that say about the reliability of information they had received throughout the war? If enemy sources provided more accurate assessments of their own side's situation than friendly sources did, how could they trust anything they had been told? The revelation became even more devastating when they realized that American intelligence about Japanese society was often more accurate than what Japanese citizens were told about their own country. Radio broadcasts described economic conditions, political tensions, and social problems within Japan that matched what the women remembered, but contradicted official Japanese reports about domestic prosperity and unity. These Americans knew more about what was really happening in Japan than most Japanese people did. They had intelligence networks, analytical capabilities, and information gathering systems that provided them with better understanding of Japanese society than Japanese authorities shared with their own citizens. The implications struck at the foundation of everything they thought they knew about information, truth, and the reliability of official sources. They had been raised to trust government reports, to believe official assessments, to accept that their leaders had access to information that made their decisions wise and necessary. Instead, they discovered that enemy intelligence was often more accurate than friendly propaganda, that foreign assessments of their situation were more realistic than domestic reports, and that the people they had been taught to hate understood their circumstances better than the people they had been taught to trust. This recognition created a psychological crisis that went far beyond questions about American character or military capabilities. It destroyed their faith in the possibility of reliable information during wartime, in the trustworthiness of official sources, and in their own to distinguish truth from propaganda. If they had been completely wrong about such fundamental questions, how could they trust their judgment about anything else? If official sources had been so systematically unreliable, how could they evaluate any information they received? If enemy reports were more accurate than friendly ones, how could they maintain loyalty to authorities who had deceived them so completely? Some prisoners tried desperately to maintain their faith in Japanese sources by explaining away American accuracy. The enemy had tortured information out of captured prisoners, they told themselves. American intelligence was based on betrayal by Japanese traitors. The accuracy of enemy reports proved the existence of extensive spy networks that had infiltrated Japanese society. But these explanations only made the situation worse by suggesting that Japanese security was so poor that enemies could gather better information about Japan than Japanese authorities could provide to their own people. If American intelligence was based on Japanese failures, what did that say about Japanese competence and effectiveness? Others tried to dismiss American honesty as a propaganda trick designed to appear credible while spreading false information. But this explanation collapsed under the weight of verifiable details that proved American reports were genuinely accurate rather than cleverly fabricated. The women found themselves in an impossible psychological position. They could no longer trust their own side's information because it had been proven systematically false. But they couldn't trust enemy information either, because accepting its accuracy would mean acknowledging that they had been fighting for lies, while their opponents had been operating from truth. The cognitive dissonance was unbearable, but it was also irreversible. They had heard too much, learned too much, seen too much to return to their previous certainties. The comfortable world of clear distinctions between truth and falsehood, friend and enemy, reliable and unreliable sources had been shattered beyond repair. What remained was a much more complex and morally ambiguous reality, where information had to be evaluated on its own merits rather than accepted based on its source, where enemies might be more honest than friends, where loyalty might require questioning rather than blind obedience. This transformation would affect every aspect of their future lives. They would never again be able to accept official information without skepticism, never again trust authority without verification, never again assume that friendly sources were more reliable than hostile ones simply because of their political allegiance. The shock had evolved from surprise about enemy character to fundamental doubt about the nature of truth itself in political conflicts. They had learned that wartime information was so systematically distorted that even enemies might be more reliable sources about your own situation than your own government. This knowledge would make them permanent skeptics, people who had learned through bitter experience that the most from those who claim to be dangerous lies often come protecting you, while uncomfortable truths often come from those designated as threats. The psychological revolution was entering its final phase, but the most devastating revelations were still to come. Because what they had learned about information and propaganda was just preparation for discoveries that would challenge their understanding of the war's very purpose and meaning. The 10th week brought the revelation that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. It came not through dramatic confrontation or shocking disclosure, but through a simple conversation with an American nurse who had grown up in Japan. Her name was Mary Tanaka, a second-generation Japanese American whose parents had immigrated to California before the war. She spoke perfect Japanese, understood their culture intimately, and had volunteered for medical service in the Pacific, specifically to help with prisoner care and translation. These Japanese women returned home carrying knowledge that would make them strangers in their own land. They had witnessed compassion from enemies, discovered humanity where they expected monsters, and learned that everything they believed about their opponents was wrong. Their shock wasn't just about American character. It was about discovering that propaganda could blind people to shared humanity, that wars could be fought between peoples who had no fundamental reason to hate each other, and that the world contained possibilities for understanding they had never been allowed to imagine. The real tragedy wasn't what they suffered in captivity, but what they had been taught to believe about human nature itself. But Mary's story was more devastating than any propaganda they had ever encountered, because it revealed the most shocking truth of all. Her family had been imprisoned in American concentration camps during the early years of the war. Japanese Americans rounded up from their homes, forced to abandon their businesses, their possessions, their entire life, and confined behind barbed wire in desert camps scattered across the American interior. The revelation hit like a physical blow. Americans had imprisoned their own citizens of Japanese descent. The same military that was treating enemy prisoners with systematic kindness had allowed their own government to incarcerate innocent families based solely on their racial background. Mary spoke about her experience with the same matter-of-fact tone they had come to expect from Americans discussing difficult topics. Her family's grocery store confiscated, their home sold for a fraction of its value, her younger brother forced to abandon his university studies, her elderly grandparents dying in camp hospitals that lacked adequate medical supplies. The psychological complexity was overwhelming. Here was proof that American society was capable of the same racial prejudice and systematic oppression that Japanese propaganda had always claimed. Yet this same nurse was now volunteering to provide medical care to Japanese prisoners, treating enemy nationals with more compassion than her own government had shown to American citizens of Japanese ancestry. How could both things be true simultaneously? How could a society that imprisoned innocent people based on race also produce individuals capable of such cross-cultural empathy? How could the same nation that had committed systematic injustice against Japanese Americans also implement prisoner of war policies that exceeded international legal requirements. Mary seemed to understand their confusion without explanation. She had wrestled with the same contradictions throughout the war, trying to reconcile love of country with knowledge of its failures, trying to maintain faith in American ideals while acknowledging American crimes. Her answer was as shocking as everything else they had discovered. People and nations could be both good and evil simultaneously. The same society that produced systematic racism could also generate movements for civil rights. The same government that implemented unjust policies could also be pressured to change them through democratic processes. American Japanese Americans had not remained silent about their imprisonment. They had organized legal challenges, filed lawsuits, demanded congressional investigations. Some had even volunteered for military service from within the camps, proving their loyalty through combat heroism while their families remained imprisoned. This active resistance to injustice was unlike anything the Japanese women had witnessed in their own society. When their government made decisions, even terrible ones, citizens were expected to accept them without protest. The idea that people could challenge their own government's policies while maintaining patriotic loyalty was psychologically revolutionary. Mary described how American newspapers had reported on the concentration camps, how some politicians had opposed them from the beginning, how religious groups and civil rights organizations had protested the imprisonment of innocent citizens. The injustice had been public, debated, and constantly challenged by Americans themselves. The contrast with their own experience was stark. Japanese military failures were never acknowledged publicly. Government policies were never subjected to open debate. Citizens who questioned official decisions faced imprisonment or worse. The system they had known made self-correction nearly impossible because criticism itself was treated as treason. Yet American democracy had not collapsed despite constant internal criticism and debate. If anything, the ability to acknowledge and address injustices seemed to make the system stronger rather than weaker. The concentration camps were wrong, Mary explained, but the fact that Americans could recognize and eventually correct such errors suggested a capacity for moral growth that rigid systems couldn't achieve. The implications were staggering. If American society could acknowledge its own failures and work to correct them, what kind of post-war world might be possible? If nations could admit mistakes and change policies based on moral arguments, what hope might exist for preventing future conflicts? But Mary's story revealed something even more profound about human nature and moral development. Despite everything her family had suffered at American hands, despite the injustice and racism they had experienced, she had chosen to serve as a medical volunteer, helping Japanese prisoners. She had transformed personal suffering into compassion for others, rather than into hatred or desire for revenge. This response to injustice was unlike anything they had been taught to expect. They had learned that suffering justified hatred, that victimization demanded vengeance, that proper response to injury was to inflict similar injury on others. Yet here was someone who had chosen to break that cycle of retaliation. Mary's choice suggested that individual moral agency could transcend even systematic oppression, that people could choose compassion over hatred regardless of how they had been treated. That personal character could overcome social pressure, political manipulation, and even genuine grievances. The psychological impact was overwhelming because it challenged their most fundamental assumptions about human nature and moral responsibility. If someone who had been genuinely victimized could choose forgiveness and service, what excused others from making similar choices? If personal suffering could be transformed into empathy rather than hatred, what justified cycles of vengeance between nations and peoples? Some prisoners struggled to process this complexity by focusing on American hypocrisy. How could a nation that imprisoned innocent civilians claim moral superiority? How could people who allowed such injustices criticize others for their wartime conduct? How could a society that practiced racism preach about human dignity. But Mary's response to these challenges was as devastating as everything else about her story. American hypocrisy didn't excuse Japanese militarism. American failures didn't justify Japanese atrocities. American racism didn't make Japanese nationalism morally superior. Every nation and every individual had to answer for their own choices, regardless of others' behavior. This individual moral responsibility was the most psychologically challenging concept they had encountered. They had been raised to think in terms of collective guilt and innocence, national virtue and vice, racial superiority and inferiority. The idea that moral judgment had to be applied to specific actions by specific people rather than to entire peoples or nations was revolutionary. Mary's personal example proved that such individual moral agency was possible. She had chosen to serve others despite her own suffering, to show compassion despite experiencing injustice, to work for understanding despite having every reason for hatred. Her choices demonstrated that human beings possessed the capacity for moral transcendence that could overcome any circumstance. The women found themselves forced to examine their own moral choices with the same individual focus. What had they done personally to resist injustice when they witnessed it? When had they chosen compassion over hatred in their own lives? How had they responded when faced with opportunities to show kindness to those designated as enemies? The questions were uncomfortable because they revealed how rarely they had exercised the kind of individual moral courage that Mary embodied. They had followed social expectations, obeyed political authorities, and accepted group judgments rather than making independent moral decisions based on personal conscience. This recognition created profound psychological discomfort because it suggested that they bore individual responsibility for their participation in systems and conflicts they might have questioned or resisted. They couldn't simply blame leaders, propaganda, or social pressure for choices they had made as individuals. But Mary's example also suggested that such moral agency was available to everyone, regardless of circumstances. If she could choose compassion despite genuine victimization, others could make similar choices despite less extreme challenges. Individual moral growth remained possible even in the most difficult situations. The hope this offered was as overwhelming as the responsibility it demanded. If people could transcend their circumstances through personal moral choice, then redemption remained possible for everyone. If individual actions could break cycles of hatred and retaliation, then progress toward better relationships between peoples remained achievable. Mary's story became a bridge between their old understanding of collective identity and guilt, and a new recognition of individual moral responsibility and possibility. She showed them that people could acknowledge their nation's failures while maintaining love of country, that they could recognize their own mistakes while working for positive change. Most importantly, she demonstrated that moral growth was an ongoing process rather than a final achievement. Americans weren't inherently good any more than Japanese were inherently evil. Both peoples contained the capacity for justice and injustice, compassion and cruelty, wisdom and error. What mattered was what individuals and societies chose to do with that capacity. This understanding would transform their approach to post-war life in ways they couldn't yet imagine. They would return to Japan carrying knowledge that transcended simple categories of victory and defeat, friend and enemy, good and evil. They would carry instead a complex understanding of human possibility that could contribute to healing, rather than perpetuating cycles of hatred. The shock of Mary's revelation was complete, but it pointed toward hope rather than despair. They had discovered that even the most profound failures could be overcome through individual moral choice, that understanding could emerge from the ashes of conflict, and that human nature contained resources for redemption that could transform any situation. The psychological revolution they had undergone was irreversible and permanent. They would never again see the world through simple moral categories. They would carry instead a more complex, but ultimately more hopeful understanding of human nature and possibility that could help build bridges across any divide. But the most shocking discovery was still ahead of them, because what they would learn in their final weeks of captivity would challenge not just their understanding of Americans or their own people, but their comprehension of what war itself meant and whether such conflicts were ever truly necessary. The transformation was nearly complete, but the most profound revelations lay just ahead, waiting to reshape their understanding of everything they thought they knew about human conflict, national loyalty, and the possibilities for peace between peoples who had every reason to remain enemies forever. The final weeks of captivity brought something that would redefine their understanding of human possibility forever. It began with an announcement that seemed impossible, delivered through interpreters with the same matter-of-fact tone used for daily routine instructions. Some of the women would be going home, not through prisoner exchange or military negotiation, but through a systematic repatriation program designed by American authorities to reunite families separated by war. The announcement came with detailed explanations of the process, the timeline, and the support that would be provided during their journey back to Japan. But here's what made their minds reel. The Americans weren't just releasing them. They were actively helping them prepare for successful reintegration into Japanese society. Medical examinations to ensure they were healthy enough for travel, psychological counseling to help them process their experiences, even basic supplies and clothing to replace what they had lost during their months of captivity. The concept was so foreign that many women initially refused to believe it. Why would victorious forces invest resources in helping enemy civilians return to hostile territory? Why provide medical care and psychological support to people who might resume opposition activities once they reached home? Why treat the repatriation of enemies as a humanitarian obligation rather than a military inconvenience? The only logical explanation was that American authorities viewed these women not as permanent enemies, but as human beings whose welfare mattered regardless of political circumstances. They were being treated as mothers, daughters, and sisters who belonged with their families, rather than as threats to be contained indefinitely. This recognition of their fundamental humanity transcended military categories and political boundaries in ways that shattered their remaining assumptions about how nations were supposed to treat each other during wartime. Enemies weren't supposed to care about each other's family reunification. Victorious powers weren't supposed to prioritize the emotional welfare of defeated populations. Yet here were American officials organizing complex logistics to ensure that Japanese civilians could return safely to their homeland, providing resources to help them rebuild their lives, and expressing genuine concern about their successful reintegration into communities they had been separated from for months. The psychological preparation for repatriation revealed another shocking aspect of American thoroughness. Counselors worked individually with each woman to help them process what they had experienced, to understand how their perspectives might have changed, and to prepare for the challenges of readjusting to life in post-war Japan. These weren't interrogation sessions or propaganda efforts. These were genuine therapeutic conversations designed to help them make sense of their experiences and develop strategies for maintaining their mental health after returning home. American personnel were investing time and expertise in the long-term psychological welfare of people who had been designated as enemies. The counselors encouraged them to talk openly about the contradictions they had observed, the questions that had emerged from their experiences, and the ways their understanding of Americans had changed during captivity. Rather than dismissing these psychological conflicts as unimportant, the counselors treated them as natural responses to complex situations that deserved serious attention. Most shocking of all, the counselors didn't try to convert them to American political views or convince them to abandon loyalty to Japan. Instead, they helped them understand how they might maintain love for their homeland while incorporating the broader understanding of human nature they had developed during their captivity. This respect for their continued Japanese identity, even while acknowledging their psychological transformation, was unlike anything they had expected from enemy authorities. They had assumed that Americans would either try to turn them into collaborators or simply release them without concern for their post-repatriation welfare. Instead, they found themselves receiving support that helped them remain authentically Japanese while growing as human beings. The Americans seemed to understand that psychological growth and national loyalty weren't incompatible, that people could love their country while acknowledging its failures, that expanding one's understanding of human possibility enhanced rather than threatened patriotic commitment. The practical preparations for repatriation were equally thorough and revealing. Each woman received new clothing appropriate for travel and initial resettlement. They were given medical supplies to address ongoing health concerns. They even received small amounts of money to help with immediate expenses upon arrival in Japan. But perhaps most importantly, they were provided with official documentation of their experiences that would help them explain their absence to family members and local authorities. These documents described their capture, their treatment in American custody, and their medical condition at the time of release without editorial comment or political interpretation. The Americans seemed to understand that these women would face difficult questions about their experiences and might need official verification to protect them from suspicion or punishment by Japanese authorities who might doubt their stories about humane treatment by enemy forces. This concern for their post-repatriation safety revealed a level of thoughtfulness about long-term consequences that went far beyond military necessity. American officials were considering how their actions might affect these women's lives months and years after the war ended, taking responsibility for ensuring that their kindness during captivity didn't create problems for them after their return home. The farewell ceremonies organized for departing prisoners provided the final shock to their understanding of American character. Rather than simply processing them through administrative procedures, American personnel organized formal send-off events that acknowledged the relationships formed during their months together. Medical staff who had treated their illnesses expressed genuine wishes for their continued health and happiness. Guards who had supervised their daily activities offered personal messages of farewell and hopes for successful family reunification. Even commanding officers took time to speak individually with departing prisoners, expressing respect for their resilience and optimism about their futures. These weren't perfunctory official courtesies. These were genuine expressions of human connection from people who had come to know them as individuals rather than simply as enemy prisoners. The Americans had formed personal attachments that transcended political boundaries and would continue to influence their thinking about Japanese people long after the war ended. One nurse later described the moment when an American doctor who had treated her sick daughter pulled her aside to give her a small gift for the child. It was a hand-carved wooden toy he had made during his off-duty hours, painted with bright colors and designed to bring joy to a little girl he would never see again. The gesture encapsulated everything that had been psychologically devastating about their captivity. This enemy soldier had spent his personal time creating something beautiful for a Japanese child, investing his own emotional energy in the happiness of someone from a nation he was fighting against, demonstrating love that transcended every boundary that was supposed to separate them. The women boarding ships for repatriation carried with them more than just personal belongings and official documentation. They carried memories of kindness from people they had been taught to hate, evidence of humanity where they had expected monsters, and proof that understanding was possible between peoples who had every reason to remain enemies forever. But they also carried questions that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. If Americans were capable of such systematic compassion toward enemy civilians, what had the war really been about? If people on both sides possessed the same capacity for love, grief, and moral growth, what had justified the hatred and violence that had torn their world apart? Most disturbing of all, they carried knowledge that would make them strangers in their own homeland. They had experienced treatment from foreign enemies that exceeded what they had often received from their own authorities. They had witnessed approaches to human dignity and individual worth that challenged their society's most fundamental assumptions about hierarchy, authority, and social organization. Some would spend the rest of their lives trying to reconcile this knowledge with loyalty to Japan, struggling to maintain love of country while acknowledging that their enemies had demonstrated superior approaches to treating human beings. Others would become quiet advocates for changes that might bring some of the benefits they had witnessed to Japanese society. All would carry permanent proof that the world contained possibilities their own culture had never allowed them to imagine. They had seen that authority could coexist with individual dignity, that strength could be combined with compassion, that military effectiveness could be achieved through systems that respected rather than crushed the human spirit. The ships carrying them home were filled with women whose understanding of human nature had been permanently transformed. They were returning to Japan carrying knowledge that could contribute to healing rather than perpetuating cycles of hatred, wisdom that could help build bridges rather than maintaining walls, and hope that even the most profound conflicts could be transcended through recognition of shared humanity. Their shock had evolved from surprise about enemy character into fundamental questions about the nature of human possibility itself. They had learned that propaganda could blind people to obvious truths, that enemies could demonstrate greater humanity than friends, and that the world was far more complex and morally ambiguous than wartime simplicities suggested. The revelation that would stay with them forever wasn't just that Americans were different from what they had expected. The revelation was that human beings everywhere possessed capacities for growth, understanding, and moral transcendence that political leaders on all sides typically ignored or suppressed for their own purposes. They were going home, carrying the most dangerous knowledge of all. The knowledge that wars might be fought between peoples who had no fundamental reason to hate each other, that conflicts might be perpetuated by leaders who benefited from hatred more than from understanding, and that ordinary people on all sides possessed the wisdom and compassion necessary to create a more peaceful world if they could overcome the propaganda that kept them separated. This knowledge would travel with them into post-war Japan and into the future, carrying seeds of understanding that might help prevent future generations from falling victim to the same lies and misunderstandings that had shaped their own tragic experience. They had been shocked into wisdom, and that wisdom would never leave them. The most profound discovery of their captivity wasn't about American character or Japanese failure. It was about human possibility itself, about the capacity for understanding that existed within every person, regardless of nationality or political allegiance, about the hope for peace that could emerge when people were allowed to see each other as human beings rather than as enemies. That discovery would echo through their lives and influence everyone they touched, carrying the possibility that their shocking revelations might contribute to a world where such understanding could flourish before rather than after devastating conflicts, where the compassion they had witnessed could prevent wars rather than simply heal their aftermath. The psychological revolution was complete and irreversible. These women would never again be able to see the world through simple categories of us and them, friend and enemy, superior and inferior. They carried instead a complex understanding of human nature that transcended all such boundaries, knowledge that could contribute to building the kind of world where their own tragic experience might never be repeated. Their ships sailed toward Japan, carrying not just repatriated prisoners, but living bridges between two worlds, witnesses to possibilities that political leaders had never allowed their peoples to imagine, proof that even the most bitter enemies could recognize their shared humanity when given the opportunity to see each other clearly. The shock of their discovery would continue reverberating long after they reached home, challenging assumptions, raising questions, and planting seeds of understanding that might someday grow into the wisdom necessary for lasting peace between all peoples who had been taught to fear and hate each other. The shock didn't end when they stepped off those ships onto Japanese soil. In many ways, it was just beginning, Imagine returning home after months away, expecting to slip back into familiar rhythms, only to discover that you've become a stranger in your own land. These women found themselves caught between two incompatible worlds. The Japan they returned to, devastated by bombing and defeat, and the broader understanding of human possibility they had discovered in American captivity. The questions began immediately. Family members, neighbors, local authorities all wanted to know what had happened during those months of imprisonment. But how do you explain that your enemies treated you with more systematic kindness than you had often experienced from your own military? How do you describe discovering humanity where you expected monsters? Some women tried to tell the truth about their experiences, describing the medical care, the regular meals, the respect for their dignity as human beings. The responses were predictable and heartbreaking. Disbelief, suspicion, sometimes outright accusations of collaboration or mental weakness. Americans don't behave that way, family members insisted. You must have been deceived by clever propaganda designed to make you compliant. The idea that enemy forces might demonstrate genuine compassion was so contrary to everything people believed that many preferred to think their own daughters and sisters had been psychologically manipulated, rather than acknowledge the possibility that their enemies possessed moral depth. Others faced worse accusations. If Americans had treated them well, some whispered, perhaps they had provided information or assistance that earned such consideration. Perhaps they had betrayed Japanese military secrets in exchange for better treatment. Perhaps they had become traitors without realizing it. The psychological pressure was enormous. These women had already struggled to reconcile their experiences with their previous beliefs. Now they had to defend their memories against people who refused to accept that such experiences were even possible. Many learned to remain silent about the details of their captivity. When asked about their treatment, they would give vague responses about survival and endurance without mentioning the systematic care, the medical attention, or the genuine human connections they had formed with American personnel. The truth had become too dangerous to share, but silence created its own psychological torture. They carried memories of kindness that they couldn't discuss, insights about human nature that they couldn't share, and questions about their own society that they couldn't voice without seeming disloyal or ungrateful for their repatriation. The contrast between what they had experienced and what they found at home became more apparent as they tried to readjust to Japanese life. The rigid hierarchies that had once seemed natural now felt oppressive after months of witnessing more collaborative approaches to authority. The suppression of individual opinion that had once seemed proper now felt stifling after experiencing environments where questioning was encouraged. Even simple interactions carried new psychological weight. When they observed Japanese officials treating subordinates harshly, they remembered American officers consulting with enlisted personnel about operational decisions. When they witnessed punishment for minor infractions, they recalled American military justice procedures that included protections for the accused. When they saw resources wasted through bureaucratic inefficiency, they remembered American logistics systems that prioritized practical results over formal protocol. The comparisons were involuntary and constant, creating a running commentary in their minds about alternative approaches to organizing human relationships. They had seen proof that different methods were possible, and that knowledge made their homeland's limitations more visible and psychologically difficult to accept. Some women found ways to channel their new understanding into positive contributions to post-war reconstruction. They became advocates for improved medical care, drawing on their observations of American hospital procedures. They supported educational reforms that might encourage more critical thinking among young people. They quietly promoted approaches to conflict resolution that emphasized understanding rather than punishment. But they had to be careful about attributing their ideas to American sources. Japanese society in the immediate post-war period was psychologically fragile, struggling to maintain dignity after devastating defeat. Suggestions that the enemy had demonstrated superior methods in any area were unwelcome and potentially dangerous to those who voiced them. The most psychologically challenging aspect of their reintegration was dealing with ongoing anti-American sentiment among people who hadn't had direct contact with American forces. Former prisoners listened to neighbors and family members expressing hatred for Americans based on the same propaganda they had once believed, knowing from personal experience that such characterizations were systematically false. They watched as Japanese media continued portraying Americans as culturally inferior and morally bankrupt even after defeat, despite clear evidence that American society had produced individuals capable of remarkable compassion and systematic respect for human dignity. The persistence of such obviously false narratives was psychologically devastating because it suggested that propaganda was more powerful than direct experience in shaping popular opinion. Some women tried to challenge these narratives indirectly, sharing stories about individual acts of kindness they had witnessed without emphasizing their American source. They would describe medical procedures they had learned, organizational techniques they had observed, or approaches to problem solving they had discovered, hoping to plant seeds of broader understanding without triggering defensive reactions. Others retreated into private reflection, keeping their transformative experiences as personal knowledge that influenced their own choices without attempting to change others' opinions. They became quiet examples of different approaches to human relationships, demonstrating in their own lives the collaborative and respectful methods they had observed during captivity. The psychological isolation was profound. They possessed knowledge about human possibility that they couldn't fully share, insights about their former enemies that contradicted popular beliefs, and understanding about alternative approaches to social organization that challenged fundamental assumptions about Japanese cultural superiority. This isolation was compounded by survivors' guilt about the positive aspects of their captivity experience. While Japanese civilians had suffered through bombing, starvation, and military oppression, these women had received regular meals, medical care, and treatment that respected their dignity as human beings. How could they acknowledge, even to themselves, that their time as prisoners had been psychologically liberating in many ways? The guilt was particularly intense when they learned about the suffering of family members and communities while they were gone. Brothers killed in combat, parents dead from malnutrition, homes destroyed by bombing raids. Their own relatively humane treatment during captivity seemed almost obscene in comparison to what their loved ones had endured. Yet they also understood that their experiences carried important lessons about human nature and the possibilities for understanding between peoples who had been taught to hate each other. Their knowledge might contribute to preventing future conflicts if it could be shared in ways that didn't threaten Japanese national pride or psychological recovery from defeat. Some women began writing private journals about their experiences, creating detailed records of what they had witnessed without any intention of publication. These documents served as psychological outlets for processing their complex feelings and as potential historical records that might someday contribute to broader understanding about the reality of war and the possibilities for peace. Others found ways to incorporate their insights into their roles as mothers, teachers, and community members. They raised children with more nuanced understanding of human nature, encouraged students to think critically about propaganda and official narratives, and promoted community activities that emphasized cooperation and mutual respect rather than hierarchy and submission. The long-term psychological impact varied among individuals, but certain patterns emerged across the group. Most retained permanent skepticism about official information and government propaganda. Most developed stronger appreciation for individual human dignity and the importance of treating all people with basic respect, regardless of their social position. Most carried lasting questions about the necessity and justification for the hatred that had driven the war they had lived through. These women returned to Japan carrying the most dangerous knowledge of all: the discovery that everything they had been taught about human nature was wrong. Their shock wasn't just about American character. It was about learning that enemies could show more humanity than friends. that propaganda could blind entire nations to obvious truths, and that wars could be fought between peoples who shared the same capacity for love, compassion, and moral growth. The real tragedy wasn't their months in captivity, but the decades of hatred that had made such understanding impossible until they were forced to see their enemies as human beings. Their transformation reminds us that the most powerful weapon against future conflicts isn't superior firepower. It's the courage to recognize our shared humanity before the shooting starts.